The sound of shrieking echoed across the pasture like a siren had gone off in the barn. I dropped my coffee, the mug shattering on the porch as I ran barefoot toward the stables. My stomach flipped before my feet even hit the dirt. I knew that scream. It wasn't one of pain or fear, it was a kid's high-pitched thrill. The kind that meant someone was doing something very, very stupid. And on my ranch, that usually meant someone was riding Maverick without permission. I turned the corner, skidded to a stop, and saw it, my worst nightmare with a side of absurdity. 2 kids, maybe 10 or 11, were clinging to the back of my prize stallion, Maverick, who looked one buck away from sending them to orbit. One of them was holding a plastic sword above his head like he was leading a cavalry charge. The other was yelling yeehaw at the top of his lungs. Standing on my fence, sipping rose from a glass like she was at a garden party, was Karen. She looked at me, smirked, and said, "Relax, it's good for their confidence." I couldn't move for a second. I wasn't sure if I was more stunned by the insanity or the sheer audacity. Maverick was no pony ride. He was a trained stallion, powerful and clever, and only calm around people he trusted. Those kids were seconds away from getting thrown, or worse, trampled. I shouted Maverick's name, a low, commanding tone he'd recognize, and the stallion stopped bucking just long enough for me to reach them. I grabbed the reins, calmed him with a whistle and a pat, and helped the kids slide off, their laughter still ringing like nails on glass. Karen clapped like it was a performance. "That was amazing," she beamed. "You've really trained him well. Mind if they come back tomorrow?" I was stunned into silence. I didn't want to lose my temper in front of the kids, but it took everything in me to keep my voice calm. "Karen, this isn't a petting zoo. These animals are dangerous if mishandled. You can't just let your kids run in here and hop on a horse like it's a playground ride." She rolled her eyes. "Oh please. If you don't want people to use them, don't keep them so close to the fence. They're practically public." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving muddy footprints on my fence and a shattered sense of peace behind her. Later that day, I walked Maverick around the pasture to calm him down. He was still tense, ears twitching, hooves restless. I rubbed his neck, whispering apologies. He hadn't hurt the kids, but it wasn't fair to put him in that situation. He was a champion, trained for precision, not chaos. Karen had no idea what kind of danger she was inviting. This wasn't just about disrespect. This was about liability, about safety, about boundaries. I wasn't sure which one she was worse at respecting. I decided to take immediate action. I installed clear warning signs all around the pasture. "No trespassing, do not enter, horses may bite," and one particularly bold one that read, "Not your pony, not your problem." Then I strung up a temporary electric wire around the pasture's perimeter. Nothing serious, just enough to startle, not injure. And just for backup, I filed a formal notice with the HOA, outlining what happened and requesting an enforcement reminder about trespassing laws. I sent a copy to the sheriff's office too, just in case this spiraled further. I had a sinking feeling it might. That night, I reviewed the footage from my barn camera just to be safe. Around midnight, the screen lit up. A shadow moved near the fence. I leaned closer. 2 small figures, flashlights in hand, ducked under the warning signs. A third figure stood at the corner, holding what looked like wire cutters. My jaw clenched. Karen. She had brought her kids back under cover of darkness. They snuck in like it was a game. Maverick's ears were pinned, his posture defensive, but he didn't charge. Thank God. The next clip showed him pacing angrily in the far end of the pasture, as Karen and her kids played near the trough like it was a petting zoo picnic. The next morning, Maverick wasn't in his stable. My heart dropped. I called his name. Nothing. I searched the pasture, then the side yards, then finally found him. Standing in the Thompsons' front yard 2 properties down, chewing on their sculpted boxwood swan. He looked at me like he was ready to retire from ranch life entirely. I walked him back quietly, every step weighing heavier than the last. That afternoon, I saw Karen strutting down the sidewalk like she hadn't committed felony trespassing 12 hours earlier. I approached her calmly. "Karen, we need to talk." Her face twisted with mock innocence. "Oh, is this about the horse thing again? I thought you'd be over that." "They didn't get hurt." I stepped closer. "They could have. That horse could have kicked. He could have broken ribs. He could have paralyzed one of your kids. And you'd have blamed me, wouldn't you?" She blinked, then grinned. "Well, they are just animals. You can't expect them to act rationally." The irony nearly knocked me over. That night, as I walked past the stables under the stars, I made a decision. If Karen wouldn't respect my boundaries, I'd find a way to make her regret crossing them. Not through violence, not through yelling. No, I'd do it with training, the same way I taught Maverick to respond to cues. Only this time, I'd teach him something special. Something unforgettable. A trick just for Karen. A trick that would send a very clear message. That I don't mess around. And neither does Maverick. The sun rose the next morning like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Maverick stood quietly in the pasture, his coat glistening from the early dew, but his eyes were wary. The chaos of the previous days had taken a toll on both of us. He was a stallion used to order, to routines, to my voice and steady hand, not screaming kids, midnight invasions, or clueless neighbors. I gave him a long brushing session before breakfast, murmuring softly, letting him know I had a plan. I wasn't going to let Karen or her sugar-fueled brats turn my ranch into their personal theme park. It was time to fight back, smartly. Later that day, I received an email from the HOA. I opened it with more dread than curiosity, already knowing it wouldn't be good. Sure enough, there it was. An official warning citing complaints about aggressive livestock behavior and unsupervised dangerous animals visible from public roads. At the bottom, it noted that the complaint had been filed by Karen L. My mouth twisted into a dry smile. She beat me to it. She'd framed me as the villain before I even finished patching the cut electric wire. I sent back a measured but firm response, attaching video footage from my security cameras and listing each trespass. Then I called the HOA president directly. His voice was thin and nervous, more worried about Karen's persistent pestering than any real evidence. "We're just trying to keep the peace, Jake," he said. I gritted my teeth. Peace wasn't kept by folding to the loudest lunatic in the room. That night, as I sat on the porch sipping lukewarm coffee, I found myself watching Maverick with new eyes. He wasn't just a victim in this mess, he was the key. He'd always been clever, even by Stallion standards. I remembered when I first trained him to open gates with his nose or tap targets on command. He had a personality, a sense of humor even. It hit me like a bolt. What if I gave him a new command, something designed not just for discipline but for defense? Not harm, not retaliation, just a trick, a lesson, something memorable. Over the next few nights, I worked with him in the dim barn light. I repeated the phrase over and over, "Go home, Maverick." I paired it with signals, nudges, posture cues. The trick was simple. If someone mounted him who wasn't me, and the phrase was spoken, he'd take off, full gallop, straight to the barn, and come to a halt at the gate. The rider? They'd be tossed, gently if they were lucky, more dramatically if not. It wasn't mean. It was brilliant. Maverick was a horse, not a weapon, and I was teaching him what he already knew instinctively: who to trust and when to act. By the fourth night, he had it nailed. I gave the phrase from 20 feet away while a friend stood nearby. Maverick twitched his ears, flared his nostrils, and dashed full speed back to the barn. The test subject, an experienced rider, bailed gracefully into the hay pile, laughing. It worked. It was subtle, legal, harmless, and absolutely perfect for someone like Karen, who wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. As fate would have it, I had another reason to ensure Maverick stayed sharp. A potential buyer was flying in from out of state. This wasn't just any sale. This was a $500,000 deal with a breeder who specialized in elite horses for international competition. I'd been prepping for months. They wanted to see Maverick calm under pressure, agile and precise. The buyer was no fool. He'd know if Maverick had been rattled or stressed. And thanks to Karen's idiocy, my stallion had been anything but calm lately. So I doubled down on care. I adjusted Maverick's feed, added calming herbs, gave him daily massages, and played classical music in the barn like he was a prizefighter prepping for a title match. I also reinforced the trick, just in case. The buyer wasn't the problem. It was the risk that Karen would strike again before he arrived. And deep down, I knew she would. People like her always do. The following morning, I saw Karen at the community mailbox, her hair up in rollers, wearing slippers like she was royalty on vacation. She waved at me with her pinky raised, as if to remind me she still believed she held the high ground. I ignored her. Later, I saw her kids climbing the HOA's new community sign, something she'd forced the neighborhood to pay for, and chucking rocks at squirrels. I didn't intervene. I didn't even look. The more I stayed quiet, the more she assumed I'd back down. Which was exactly what I wanted her to believe. That night, I prepared the stable with fresh straw, cleaned Maverick's hooves myself, and laid out gear for a clean demonstration in front of the buyer. I checked the cameras one last time, cleaned the lenses, and recharged the batteries. I had a gut feeling. When someone like Karen gets quiet, it usually means they're planning something loud. Sure enough, at 3:08 a.m., a faint motion alert buzzed on my phone. I shot out of bed, pulled on jeans and boots, and checked the live feed. There she was. Karen, flashlight in hand, kids trailing behind her like ducks, slipping through the fence like it was some secret rite of passage. They crept toward the barn with a ridiculous sense of stealth, giggling and whispering. Karen opened Maverick's gate with the kind of confidence only someone who knew absolutely nothing about horses could muster. I didn't stop them. Not yet. I knew what I needed to see. The kids coaxed Maverick out. One of them actually pulled a carrot from his jacket like a bribe. Maverick, to his credit, didn't bolt or buck. He sniffed, stood still, and waited. One kid hopped on. Then the other. Karen gave some absurd direction like "now remember, lean forward when he goes fast." I nearly laughed. I grabbed the mic connected to my barn speaker and whispered the phrase, "Go home, Maverick." Instantly, the stallion reared slightly, not enough to throw them, just enough to shift weight, and then charged. Not in panic. Not in rage. Just purposeful, trained motion. He took off down the path, past the trough, straight toward the barn gate. The kids screamed, clinging to each other. Karen chased after them, losing her slipper in the mud. At the last second, Maverick halted. The kids? Not so much. They landed in a pile of fresh hay and manure, screaming and flailing. I walked out from behind the barn, slow and steady. Karen looked up from the mud, horror and fury all over her face. "What the hell was that?" she shrieked. "You trained him to do that?" I nodded. "Yep. Smartest horse on the ranch. Only listens to people who belong here." She opened her mouth, then shut it, seeing the blinking red of the security camera above the gate. She had no idea what was coming next. But I did. And I couldn't wait. The next morning rolled in quietly, almost too quietly, like the calm before a storm that had already begun forming somewhere just out of sight. Maverick stood tall and proud in the pasture, a little more smug than usual if I was being honest. It was like he knew what he had done and was waiting for a round of applause. I gave him an extra apple, half for the trick and half because I couldn't stop laughing every time I thought of those two kids tumbling headfirst into a pile of hay laced with manure. It wasn't just revenge. It was poetic justice. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't going to let this go. People like her never do. They treat consequences like personal insult. Sure enough, not 2 hours later, I got a knock on my front door. I opened it to find Karen, hair done, sunglasses perched like she was avoiding paparazzi, holding a manila folder like it was the key to the kingdom. Behind her stood a man in a polo shirt that had HOA stitched onto the chest, looking about as confident as a squirrel in a dog park. She thrust the folder at me. I'm filing a formal complaint. Your horse is a threat to public safety. My horse was on my property. Your kids weren't. That makes you the threat. She hissed through her teeth and turned to her HOA lackey. Tell him. The man cleared his throat and said something about community harmony and shared space views, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't want to be there. I handed him the printed screenshots from the night before, complete with timestamps, Karen's flashlight in clear view, and both kids riding bareback like it was a mechanical bull contest. His expression drained. He mumbled, "I think we've got all we need," and walked back to his golf cart in record time. Karen didn't budge. She doubled down. This isn't over. You've created a hostile environment. I'm calling animal control, and CPS, and maybe even the news. I'm sure they'd love a story about a deranged rancher endangering children. I just smiled, leaned on the fence, and said, "Good. Maybe they'll also love the footage of you breaking and entering." Her jaw clicked shut like a bear trap. By that afternoon, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. I caught glimpses of people whispering as I drove my ATV down the street. A few waved. Others looked away. It didn't matter. I wasn't here to win a popularity contest. I was here to protect what was mine. And I had something else to focus on now anyway, the buyer. He was scheduled to land in 2 days, and he was bringing his assistant and a horse behavior specialist. That meant everything had to be perfect. The fencing, the barn, Maverick's temperament, it all had to reflect discipline and quality. I couldn't afford another midnight circus from Karen and her gremlins. I reinforced the pasture gate, swapped out the electric wire for a motion-triggered alarm system, and kept Maverick closer to the barn. I also had the sheriff's office file a courtesy report, not a formal charge yet, but enough to document what happened for future use. Sheriff Lacey, who dealt with Karen before, chuckled over the phone and said, "She thinks she runs the county, but she's about to get an education in fences and felony trespassing." I liked the sound of that. The next day, just before sunset, I saw something that confirmed what I'd been expecting. Karen wasn't done, she was regrouping. Her kids were back on their bikes circling the pasture, pretending not to look in, while she stood at the corner with binoculars like some HOA sniper. I didn't confront her. I just walked Maverick to the front gate, leaned over, and whispered the phrase again. "Go home, Maverick." He flicked his ears, turned, and trotted back to the barn with the same precise grace as before. Karen watched the whole thing with squinted suspicion. She knew something had changed. She just didn't know what yet. That evening, as I reviewed the camera logs and backed everything up on a hard drive, I saw something curious. Around midnight, a shadow crept up to the pasture. It wasn't Karen this time. It was one of the kids, alone. I watched as he approached the fence and called softly, "Hey, horsey." Maverick didn't move. The kid climbed up the gate, swung his leg over, and tried to mount. I sat up straight. Then, just as I was about to run outside, I saw it. Maverick stood still, let him get on, and then, unprompted, bolted toward the barn again. No verbal cue. Just intuition. The kid screamed, flew off mid-run, and landed in a puddle left by last week's irrigation. I hit pause. Maverick stopped dead center at the barn door and looked straight at the camera. I nearly choked laughing. He didn't need my words anymore. He knew who belonged and who didn't. And he'd made his choice. The next morning, Karen came pounding on the gate with wet clothes, a sopping child, and fury boiling in her voice. "This is harassment. You've turned that animal into a weapon. He targeted my son." I said nothing at first, just raised my hand to the camera behind me. Her eyes followed it. "You know that's recording, right?" She looked at the lens, then back at me. "You can't just let a wild animal attack children." I leaned forward. "Then keep your children off my land. You were warned." She sputtered and turned back toward her house, dragging her now silent son with her. What she didn't know was that while she was busy embarrassing herself, my buyer had landed early. He had driven by in a rental car that morning to get a feel for the place, and he'd seen the tail end of the tantrum. That afternoon, he arrived at my gate with his assistant and behaviorist. He shook my hand, grinning. "We heard your horse is smart. Protective too." The assistant smirked. "We watched the footage. Maverick might be the most self-aware stallion I've ever seen. Is that part of the package?" We walked to the barn, and Maverick stood tall, head high, muscles calm and centered. I handed over the reins for the inspection. They tested his gait, his reaction to unfamiliar voices, his discipline under pressure. He passed everything with flying colors. Then the buyer turned to me and asked, "Mind showing us that little trick we heard about?" I nodded, mounted Maverick, and led him to the field. I let the assistant climb on gently, then stepped back and gave the cue. "Go home, Maverick." Without missing a beat, he took off, gliding like thunder on grass. The assistant didn't even fall. He just dismounted mid-run and laughed like a kid on a roller coaster. Maverick stopped at the barn like clockwork. The buyer clapped. "That's a stallion with instincts, memory, and heart. We're ready to make the offer." I nodded, shook his hand, and smiled. Just one more piece left. One more lesson for Karen to learn. Because while the horse might be sold soon, the message had only just begun to spread. Maverick wasn't just trained. He was loyal. And in this little town, people were starting to hear his story. A stallion that could tell the difference between a rider and a trespasser. A horse that knew right from wrong. The kind of reputation even a Karen couldn't bury. The day after the demonstration, the air on the ranch felt lighter, but I wasn't fooled. Just because Maverick had won over the buyer and impressed them with his sharp instincts didn't mean Karen was done causing trouble. In fact, it made her more dangerous. People like her don't accept defeat. They stew in it. They plot. They wait until they think the timing's just right, then strike again louder, messier, and even more entitled. I could feel something brewing. Maverick was sharp that morning too, pacing the fence line more than usual, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling like radar dishes. Animals always know before we do when a storm's coming, even when it's human. I got confirmation of my suspicion just before lunch. I was refilling Maverick's trough when my phone buzzed with a call from Sheriff Lacey. I answered and immediately heard the sigh in her voice. "You're gonna love this one," she said dryly. "Karen's filed a theft report. Claims someone, meaning you, stole her son's phone and tampered with his social media. Says there's video of the incident with the horse going viral, and she's convinced you're responsible for it." I nearly laughed. That video came from my security footage, and her son was never holding a phone during the fall. If anything, it was probably a neighbor filming from their window. Still, I appreciated the heads-up. Lacey added, "She's also threatening to go to the media with some story about animal abuse. I told her I'd gladly escort a journalist through your ranch myself." I thanked her, hung up, and headed inside to check my email. Sure enough, there was one from a local news reporter requesting comment on a situation involving a neighborhood dispute and an alleged dangerous animal. The subject line said urgent, but the body read more like clickbait. I decided not to reply yet. I figured Karen would do something reckless soon, something that would flip the whole situation in my favor. She always did. That afternoon, I spent more time with Maverick, working through some advanced drills, just to keep him sharp. I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly he had internalized that phrase, how his entire body reacted to it like it was part of his nature now. "Go home, Maverick." It wasn't just a command. It had become a principle. That night, I turned in early, hoping for a quiet morning before the final buyer papers were signed. At about 3 in the morning, the alarm system blared. I shot up, adrenaline flooding me. I checked the camera feed on my phone, and my jaw clenched instantly. Maverick was gone. The pasture gate was wide open, latch broken clean off. The camera facing the road caught a blurry shape, Karen's SUV. I couldn't see plates, but I knew it was hers from the scratched bumper and the dented back hatch. I jumped into my truck and sped down the road, trying to catch up, but the trail was cold by the time I hit the main road. I called Lacey and told her what had happened. She didn't ask if I was sure. It was already obvious. "Meet me at her property," she said. We rolled up in separate vehicles around dawn. Karen was in her driveway, dressed like she'd just woken up, robe, slippers, fake yawns, the whole routine. "What's going on?" she asked sweetly. I stepped out, dead calm. "You wouldn't happen to know where my horse is, would you, Karen?" She blinked. "Your horse, you mean the aggressive one you trained to buck children," I gasped, hands mockingly going to my chest. "You mean the one that vanished from my locked pasture last night and was seen leaving in your SUV?" Lacey stepped forward, arms crossed. "Karen, mind if we check the backyard, just a formality?" Karen hesitated. "You need a warrant." Lacey smiled. "I've got one coming. But while we wait, let's make this easy." Karen stood frozen for a second, then shouted, "They're just animals. No one owns them like furniture. They wander." "I don't even know what horse you're talking about," Lacey signaled, and I pulled out my phone, opened the GPS tracking app, and showed her the blinking dot 2 blocks over, in the small wooded lot behind Karen's property. We walked around and found Maverick standing beneath a pine tree, tied to a garden swing with a frayed pink leash and a bucket of dog food nearby. He looked insulted but unharmed. Karen's kids were standing a few feet away trying to feed him Doritos. I walked up slowly, untied the leash, and checked him over. No scratches, no marks, just a tired, confused look in his eyes. I led him out by the halter, as Lacey called it, in. Theft, trespassing, illegal containment of livestock. Karen stood at the fence, eyes wide as reality caught up with her. She had gone too far. Again. Back at the ranch, I gave Maverick a warm bath and let him rest in the paddock. I sat on the porch with a thermos of strong coffee and watched the sun rise. Karen had finally crossed the last line. There would be no more complaints, no more threats. What came next wasn't up to me anymore. The law was moving, and even the HOA couldn't shield her from this one. That afternoon, the buyer returned with a full legal team. They weren't just horse people. They were investors, and now that this mess had gone public, they wanted more than just a sale. They wanted a story to go with their champion Stallion. So I told it. I showed them the footage, the security logs, the legal notices. They laughed at the absurdity, marveled at Maverick's performance, and asked if I'd be okay with the story being used in future promotion. I agreed. Why not? The truth was better than anything they could make up. The deal was finalized right there in my living room. $500,000 wired, contracts signed, ownership transferred pending pickup next week. But there was one thing I asked for in writing. Until the transfer date, Maverick would remain under my care. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I wanted to make sure he got one last moment on the ranch. One last peaceful stretch before the next chapter in his life. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I walked Maverick out to the ridge trail where he loved to run. He trotted ahead of me, free and confident. I gave the cue one more time. "Go home, Maverick." And he did. Not because he had to. Because he knew that home was safety. And after the last few weeks, so did I. But I also knew Karen had one final card to play. Something told me she wasn't done just yet. And I was right. Because that night, she didn't just call the news station. She invited them to film live. The next morning started like any other but carried an eerie weight, like the stillness that settles just before lightning splits the sky. Maverick was back to his usual self, munching hay, tossing his mane dramatically at flies, and pacing along the fence with that practiced, regal confidence that made him look more like a four-legged general than a horse. But something in the air was off. The birds weren't singing. The wind had gone quiet. I sipped my coffee on the porch and waited for the next chapter of this circus to reveal itself, and sure enough, it didn't take long. Around 10, I heard the low rumble of tires on gravel. I stepped down the porch steps just as a brightly wrapped news van pulled up to the edge of my property, complete with a satellite dish on top and a cameraman already stepping out. Behind them came Karen, dressed like she was auditioning for some reality courtroom drama. She wore a crisp white blouse, oversized sunglasses, and a tragic expression pasted across her face like a mask. She spoke to the camera crew in a hushed, dramatic tone, pointing toward my ranch as if she were narrating a documentary about war crimes. I didn't go down to greet them. I just stood where I was, arms crossed, waiting. A female reporter stepped up to the fence with a microphone, gestured toward the camera, and began her segment. Viewers, we're here today outside a rural property that's been the subject of controversy between a local homeowner and an alleged aggressive horse. The animal in question has reportedly injured 2 children and was seen being trained in evasive maneuvers that some are calling dangerous and inappropriate for a residential setting. I nearly choked on my coffee. Dangerous and inappropriate, that was rich coming from the woman who had tied my horse to a swing set and fed him dog food. Maverick, standing behind me, let out a loud, theatrical snort as if he agreed. I walked slowly toward the fence, not hurrying, not dragging my feet, just giving the moment the weight it deserved. The cameraman saw me approaching and turned his lens toward us. Karen perked up like she thought she'd won. She took off her sunglasses and gave her best imitation of a tearful glare. I stopped a few feet from the reporter and said, "If you're going to do a story, I suggest you do the whole story." She blinked, startled by my calm tone. "Would you care to comment on the alleged incidents involving your horse?" "Yes. I have nothing to hide." I invited them to the barn, told them to bring their cameras, and handed them a flash drive with all my security footage, HOA complaints, text messages, and audio from my security system. I even had printed screenshots from the GPS tracking of Maverick the night Karen stole him. The cameraman's eyes widened as he flipped through the stack of paper. Karen's face turned red, her mouth twitching like it wanted to shout something but couldn't decide what. The reporter hesitated, clearly sensing the tone shift. "You're saying you have documented evidence that contradicts her version of events?" I nodded. "More than enough. And if you'd like, I can show you how Maverick responds to strangers versus trained commands. He's not aggressive. He's smart. He protects himself. I protect him. That's the difference." We walked back to the paddock where Maverick was now watching everything like he was the showrunner. The reporter stayed behind the fence while I climbed in, whistled Maverick over, and gently gestured for him to allow the assistant cameraman to approach. As expected, Maverick stood still, calm, alert. Then I gave the phrase, "Go home, Maverick." Like clockwork, he turned and trotted back to the barn at a controlled pace, stopping just inside the gate. The cameraman's jaw dropped. "That's not aggression. That's intelligence." I turned to the crew and said, "He was trained not to kick, bite, or panic. He was trained to leave the situation without harming anyone. And the people calling that dangerous are the same ones who broke onto my land, trespassed, and endangered my animals." Karen exploded then. "You trained him to embarrass my family. You humiliated my children on camera. I demanded you take that footage down, and you refused. I've had enough of this." The reporter turned to her calmly. "Ma'am, we're live right now." Karen froze, mouth half open, finally realizing the circus wasn't hers to control anymore. It was out in the world now. She stormed off toward her car without another word, nearly tripping over her heels in the grass. The camera lingered on her for a moment, then swung back to me. The crew thanked me for my time and promised to review everything before airing a follow-up. But the damage had already been done. Not to me, to her. The clip went viral by sunset. Someone online titled it, "The Smartest Horse in America Outsmarts Entitled Karen," and it spread like wildfire. The footage of Maverick gently tossing the kids into the hay became a meme. "Go home, Maverick" became a trending phrase. People made t-shirts, reaction videos, and even a parody TikTok song. Karen was publicly roasted in every corner of the internet that week. And the best part, she couldn't sue, couldn't demand it be taken down, because she had trespassed and all the footage was legally recorded on private property. A week later, Maverick was picked up by the buyer's team and loaded into a custom transport trailer with more padding than most luxury RVs. He didn't flinch. He stood proud and calm as they drove off, heading toward his new home where he'd be trained for world-class competition. I watched him go with a strange mix of pride and sadness, like watching your kid graduate early. But he had earned it, and so had I. As for Karen, she received a cease and desist from the buyer's lawyers after she tried to contact media outlets with false stories. Her HOA privileges were revoked after her abuse of authority was exposed. She quietly listed her house for sale a month later, citing personal stress and a hostile community. The new neighbors who moved in were a retired couple who brought their own ponies and politely asked if I offered training sessions. The ranch went back to peace after that. No screaming, no sneaking, no midnight alarms. Just the sounds of the wind, the animals, and the occasional laughter from the neighbors who still whispered about the day Maverick went viral. I had the footage framed in my living room, just one screenshot. Karen mid-yell, kids mid-air, Maverick mid-gallop. And beneath it, a small wooden plaque with two simple words. Go home.